This is Adam Gorney with Respect My Decision podcast this week, joined again by national recruiting analyst John Garcia, who flew across the country for Elite 11 and OT7. We're now back home, rested, and ready to talk about it. The biggest surprise, John, was that Julian Sayin, not a surprise that he won it, but a surprise that he looked like the best quarterback there, if not the country. How do you foresee number one, Dylan Raiola, number four, Julian Sayin, and weighing, one event and then saying being good at OT7 too in terms of final rankings here?
Yeah, first of all, some extra shout outs for Julian Sayin going to OT7 the same day Elite 11 ended. And he's the only quarterback I saw who took a Friday night style shot in 7-on-7. But he fired that thing in there, got right back up, and probably led a touchdown drive soon after. So toughness, not a question with Sayin. And I think that's the biggest thing is Julian does everything well. There's no glaring weakness, but physically there's also no overwhelming strength. When you compare him to Raiola, who's got this great build and this, Patrick Mahomes style and arm that, every one of his 5 throws, you're like, my goodness, how many people alive can do this? So that's really the conundrum. Is it floor versus ceiling? Is it traits versus what we've seen? That's really the nitpickiness that we have to go through between these two guys in particular. But, the Elite 11 does hold a lot of weight. I don't want to minimize that either, because this is the only time we get these guys one-to-one every single day competing with each other. And you see a lot of that come out, positive or negative, throughout those 3 days, because you're going to have some bad throws. You're going to be off target just a little bit. How do you respond to that? I thought both of those guys showed that true desire, but the fire and consistency Julian plays with is really hard to oversell. I mean, it's really constant in his game, and it reflects what he does on Friday nights as a surely accurate and efficient player. So if it's about playing point guard out there, it's hard to find a better quarterback in this cycle than Julian Sayin. But if it's about making that, Eli Manning to Mario Manningham throw in the Super Bowl, hitting that hole in the window, Raiola's talent is overwhelmingly positive in that direction. So I think it's a debate that is going to last probably through signing day at this point between these two. But I also thought the week out there showed us this class is better than we thought. There are some 3 stars that really looked good and some low 4 stars that are going to look like they're underranked at this point. So I did like the collective out there at the Elite 11. I didn't think there was a guy who looked like he truly did not belong. And that's unfortunately not always the case.
Yeah. I like the word toughness with Sayin, because the coffee shops and the surf shops and the Pacific Ocean views and Carlsbad, don't get confused. The kid is has a little dog factor in him. Definitely a competitive kid. On the sidelines, about halfway through the pro day, which is sort of like the all important day, he came up to me and asked what the high score was. So he was definitely interested in it. Raiola struggled in the accuracy competition the next day. He was definitely bummed out about it. It's not like he didn't care about it. These guys are definitely there to compete and make a name for themselves. So that's going to be an interesting debate. The other debate, and we've talked about this a lot, some off the record conversations too, Dylan Raiola against Ryan Puglisi when they get to Georgia. Puglisi gave me the sense that he's not the kid that wants to be QB2 at Georgia. He wants to go there and really compete for this, thinks he could, and is not going to take a back seat to anybody there.
Reminds me of Mac Jones, because that year he was coming into Alabama, he was always looked at as the QB2 to Tua Tagovailoa. Now, it kind of worked out for both of them, and we don't always see that. But Jones was the second guy to commit, and he never wavered on that because he's just a confident kid. He's got that clear to see chip on his shoulder. And I saw a lot of that from Puglisi out there. First of all, bigger than I thought. I thought he was more physically well put together than maybe I expected, and especially compared to Mac Jones, no disrespect to the Duval native. But then he could rip it too. That's the difference. I thought he, in a vacuum, if you didn't know about the recruiting situations leading up to that event and you would have walked away saying that kid's committed to Georgia, I don't think anybody would have been surprised by that. And I think going into it, if we had said that, I think you get some variance in the answer. So yeah, Puglisi's not going to take a backseat to anyone. Of course, they were cordial and spent a lot of time together in LA. But yeah, quarterback is its own animal when it comes to those things. And I think there's a reason why Georgia is bringing in two. You know, you always have to, go for the best. And I think that's easy to see, but you've got to bring in guys who are willing to go out there and battle. Because I don't think, and this goes for Raiola as well, I don't think a lot of these elite quarterbacks would be okay with a two quarterback class. So for both
Yeah.
of them to be on board and appearing incredibly solid, when Puglisi's getting his phone calls every week from these other schools after Raiola committed, I do like that about Georgia's situation and their approach, and certainly Puglisi's approach mentally, but physically, he's no slouch, no doubt.
Let's talk about some surprises. Luke Romanhope finished dead last in the pro day. He really did not look good. And I think if he was on here, he would admit it too. It was just not his best performance. But I came out of the weekend thinking, man, this guy could be legit at Florida State. He could start. He could be the guy that takes, Mike Norvell to the next stage here. And it's because he's hyper competitive. He played a different position. He's only had 1 year of varsity football. But he's got like athleticism and traits that you really like.
Yeah, and his arm talent is great. Usually with those guys, you're like, okay, well, the motion's a little bit funky and it doesn't come out quite right. That thing hums with
Yeah.
Croman Hawk. So I think that's really where you start to get excited about his future. And like you said, day two, not his best day, but he bounced back really nicely in the accuracy challenge and in 7-on-7 and really kind of reversed the feel of that pro day night. So I like that too. Those are the other elements we get to see at the Elite 11. How do you deal with failure? Danny O'Neal had an awful day one, came back and had a much better day 2 and 3. So we get to see some quarterbacks who didn't breeze through it like Julian's saying, and I think that's great value in the evaluation business. So yeah, that 3-star ranking I think is a little old in our minds, and he'll be getting a strong bump here come August because he absolutely earned it. And again, it's not like we're compensating physically here. He's 6'2", 6'3", 200 pounds. And like you said, his pedigree was at wide receiver before the last, 18 months. So all of that bodes very well for his trajectory. And you also have to tip your cap to the Florida State evaluation, taking him before he ever started his first varsity game. That was a heck of a call by Mike Norvell, and I think he's going to get rewarded for it.
Yeah, and I think Trevor Jackson was the other one that I would like to talk about as a surprise. He's a high 3, but I remember one of the drills where they just really sort of lined up and started gunning the ball. I would stand right behind the receiver and praying that he caught every ball or I would have been dead. But the ball was really, of any quarterback there, I think he threw it the hardest, the fastest, and it spun really well. You could hear it zipping in like a Major League Baseball in there. And on the pro day, if he would have hit 2 deep balls early on, he would have had a much, much higher score because especially his timing routes were dead on. He was phenomenal in that. Just talk about him and kind of where you see the recruitment going now. There might be a little bit of confusion in terms of a Miami offer. Is Pitt the team to beat? Where do you kind of see this playing out now that UCLA is offered?
Yeah, this one is twisting and turning as we speak here. But look, Trevor, you talk about a motivated kid. He was the lowest ranked kid, I think, across the board, all networks going into the Elite 11. And the first big measurement was that event that you just broke down. Just say, hey, who can rip it the hardest? And everybody was oohing and eyeing when Jackson spun it. So from the jump, he set the tone. Hey, I'm here to compete. And then he won the rail shot competition that night, which is more about pushing it down the field with great long ability and timing. So I thought he showed the whole arsenal. As you said, a couple deep balls got away from him at the pro day, but everything else was on point, and he had a really good day 3 as well. The motion is really condensed with him, and the ball comes out tight, but the resume, kind of like Luke's, wasn't there. 1-year starter, and he got hurt, so it doesn't have the body of work that some of these other guys have. So you understand why not only his rankings were sort of slow, but his recruitment had been off to a slower start as well. But since then, Miami has upped communication. Whether they have offered or not remains to be seen, but UCLA did offer last week. Maryland has offered him a scholarship, and Pitt was already involved. So it looks like he's got more options than he certainly thought he would. And I think it could potentially push his recruitment just a little bit further into the summer. Normally, these quarterbacks want to wrap up the process, but he's the last man standing out of these 20 guys, and I think it could last a little bit longer because he's got to get out to some of these schools to truly see his options. But in terms of where he's been, you got to feel really good about Pitt, because that's the only official visit he's taken that is to a program that's still looking for their QB1. So Pitt, I think timeliness wise is in really good shape, but no doubt other schools are calling and trying to learn more on Trevor Jackson after that impressive showing.
Let's talk about throwing motions, because this is an important conversation, maybe more important. I mean, maybe less important than we put on it, but maybe not. Larry Bird didn't have the smoothest stroke. Steph Curry shoots everything off balance. Like, those kinds of things. DJ Lagway has a quirky throwing motion, and Jaden Davis dips the ball dramatically behind him where edge rushers will knock it away. I mean, that will be two things that need to be addressed. How do you address it, and how much weight should we put into it? Doesn't look the greatest, but it gets to where it needs to go.
Yeah, I think both of those guys compensate for the motion with great power. I will give him that, especially Lagway. I think the other quarterbacks will tell you, outside of Jackson, it was probably Lagway who was putting the most velocity, the most consistent velocity on the football. So he also does it from a taller release point. He's a legitimate 6'4". Few quarterbacks look better on the hoof than DJ Lagway. And while it is a little bit whippy, I would say baseball-ish, and he does have a baseball background, he does still release it relatively high. And he's 6'4". Davis, on the other hand, is 6'2"-ish, and he releases it even lower than Lagway does. So now, to me, you're minimizing your area. Everyone's talking about Bryce Young in the NFL looking so small, but Bryce is delivering it higher technically than Jaden Davis is, despite being 3 or 4 inches shorter. So I do think the motion has a huge impact. Again, Phillip Rivers was funky, but he was 6'5", 6'6". So you didn't notice it as much because he wasn't getting his balls deflected. And I also think it has a big impact on the deep ball. And that is where we saw more inconsistencies with really both of those players as the week at the Elite 11 wore on. So I do think you put some stock into it, because we have to go off of precedent. There are just not many guys who, Tim Tebow, Phillip Rivers, who dip the ball or have a elongated motion that were still able to sustain success at the highest level, which is obviously what we're trying to project.
So let's talk potential 5 stars, and there are no guarantees here, and things can change. I think CJ Carr is a guy that we have to discuss, and Jake Merklinger wasn't there, so we can't discuss him. But Aaron Noland might have been the guy who I will politic most for, of saying, hey, yes, he's a lefty. Okay, I get it. But he's technically incredibly sound, and every ball is almost thrown perfectly. So break down those two, what you think of them, and what I said, if it's right.
Yeah, both of them have a little Julian Sayin in them, in where they're not going to physically make your jaw drop with an 80-yard throw. But if you look up at the stats and the numbers, it's like, man, this guy doesn't miss. When those two, Carr and Nolan, get into a rhythm, it looks great. It looks consistent. Both of them have elite footwork as well. So all of the little things mechanically from a polish standpoint are very strong with these two, and the results speak for themselves. I mean, both of them multi-year starters, incredibly productive on Friday nights. And in a vacuum, if you took everyone's 10 best throws, I think Nolan and Carr's would be right up there with Sayin, Raiola, and the other top performers at this event. So I think that says a lot, because it's about getting the football there. It doesn't have to be Trevor Jackson velocity every single time. It just has to be there. And both of them, in between the ears, I think, from an anticipation and accuracy standpoint, they just get it. They have it. All that QB1 stuff. What is it? They both have that. So I could see each of them in the not only QB1 conversation, but the 5-star conversation before all is said and done, especially in this day and age. And I think as we sort of update our evaluations, you have to take the modern game into account. And the guys who are throwing the hardest aren't always the ones, winning the most games at the highest level. It's those point guards out there who are distributing. I think Drew Brees sort of changed that whole perception of quarterbacking, and now you're seeing, your Tua Tagovailoas of the world go out there and rack up crazy numbers without going crazy with their arm strength. And I think these guys can sort of follow in that line.
All right, we could talk a lot more Elite 11. We're going to stop there. That is the Respect My Decision podcast for this week.